The dress smelled faintly of mothballs and regret. I pulled it from the back of my closet that evening, letting the fabric unfold in my hands like something defeated. It was a dull brown thing, shapeless and worn at the seams, with buttons that didn't quite match, and a hem that had been repaired too many times to count. Perfect. Exactly what I needed. My father's voice drifted up from the ground floor, that particular tone he used when he wanted to sound important. Booming, performative. He was entertaining someone tonight. Someone he deemed significant enough to summon me downstairs like a prop in whatever show he was orchestrating. I'd learned long ago that these dinners were never about family. They were about alliances, posturing, the endless chess game of pack politics that I wanted no part of. So I chose this dress deliberately. A quiet rebellion. A way of saying I don't belong here without having to speak the words aloud. The late afternoon light filtering through my window was dying, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. I could hear the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, smell the rich aroma of roasted meat and herbs. My father sparing no expense, as always. The house felt too warm, too full of expectation. I wanted to crack open a window and let the autumn air rush in. Wanted to feel something real instead of this manufactured atmosphere of importance. But I didn't. I just stood there, holding that terrible dress, thinking about how I'd become so good at making myself small. It hadn't always been this way. Once, when I was younger, I'd believed I had a place in this world. I'd trained with the other young wolves, learned to fight and hunt and navigate the complex hierarchies of pack life. My hair, pale blonde, almost silver in certain light, had marked me as different, but I'd thought that might be a good thing. Unique. Special, even. Then came the trials. I was 16 when they tested our wolves. When we were supposed to shift for the first time in front of the entire pack, it was meant to be a celebration, a rite of passage. I remembered standing in the clearing with the others, feeling the moon pull at something deep inside me, feeling the change begin, and then nothing. My wolf had been there. I'd felt her, but she was wrong. Too small. Too quiet. When the others shifted into powerful, sleek creatures, I'd managed only a partial transformation, something incomplete and humiliating. The pack had fallen silent. My father's face had gone carefully blank, which was somehow worse than anger. Weak bloodline, someone had whispered. Defective, said another. From that night forward, I'd been invisible. Not shunned exactly. My father's position as beta protected me from outright rejection, but overlooked. Forgotten. The girl who couldn't shift properly, who would never truly belong, so I learned to retreat, to make myself useful in quiet ways, helping with pack records, organizing supply inventories, tending to the elderly wolves who no longer cared about dominance and hierarchy. I found peace in the margins, in the spaces between things, and I learned to dress the part. The dress slipped over my head easily, hanging loose on my frame. I'd lost weight over the years, stopped caring about how I looked when no one was looking back. My blonde hair I twisted into a simple knot at the nape of my neck, deliberately messy, a few strands falling free to frame my face. No jewelry, no makeup. Nothing that might suggest I'd tried. A knock sounded at my door. Miss Elena. It was Catherine, one of the house staff, her voice gentle. She'd always been kind to me. Your father requests your presence downstairs. The guest has arrived. Elena. Sometimes I forgot that was my name. I'd become so accustomed to being no one that my own identity felt borrowed. I'll be down in a moment, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Catherine hesitated. He seemed quite insistent that you dress appropriately. I almost laughed. This is appropriate, I said, smoothing down the shapeless brown fabric. It's honest. I could practically feel her concern through the door, but she was too well trained to argue. Her footsteps retreated down the hallway, and I was left alone with my reflection in the tarnished mirror above my dresser. The girl looking back at me was a stranger, pale and thin, with shadows under her blue eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. My hair caught what little light remained, but it only made me look more ghostly, insubstantial, like I might fade away entirely if no one remembered to look for me. Good. I thought. Let them forget you're even there. I descended the stairs slowly, each step measured and reluctant. The sounds of conversation grew louder. My father's voice, and another, deeper and more measured. There was something about that second voice that made my skin prickle with awareness, but I pushed the sensation away. Probably just another ambitious pack leader, here to discuss territories or treaties or whatever it was that men like my father found so consuming. The dining room doors were open, spilling warm light into the hallway. I paused just outside, stealing a moment to prepare myself. Through the gap, I could see the table set with our finest china, candles already lit despite the daylight not quite gone. My father stood at the head of the table in his formal jacket, his dark hair silvered at the temples, his expression one of carefully controlled pleasure. And beside him, my heart stopped. I couldn't see the guest's face from this angle, just his profile and the set of his shoulders. But there was something in the way he held himself, a quality of absolute certainty, of power held in check, that made the air itself seem to bend around him. He wore dark clothing, simple but clearly expensive, and even from here I could sense the weight of his presence, the way everything in the room seemed to orient toward him like compass needles finding north. No, I thought, it can't be. But even as I denied it, some part of me already knew. I'd only seen him once before, 3 years ago, when the Alpha King had visited our territory on official business. I'd been in the crowd, anonymous and unimportant, but I'd watched him address the gathered packs and felt something shift inside me. He'd spoken about unity, about protecting the weak, about how true strength wasn't domination but responsibility. And when his eyes had swept across the crowd, dark, almost black, holding depths I couldn't fathom, I'd felt seen for the first time in years. I'd gone home that night and dreamed of him. Dreamed of what it might be like to be noticed by someone like that, to be chosen, to be valued. It was a foolish fantasy, the kind of thing I should have outgrown, but in the privacy of my own mind, I'd let myself imagine, let myself want. And now he was here, in my father's house, for dinner. And I was wearing this goddamn dress. Panic clawed up my throat. I should run back upstairs, change into something, anything else. But my father was already turning, already gesturing me forward. Ah, there she is. His smile was tight, controlled. Elena, come meet our distinguished guest. There was no escape. I forced my feet to move, forced myself to step into the light of the dining room, acutely aware of every horrible detail of my appearance, the shapeless dress, the carelessly pinned hair, the complete absence of any effort whatsoever. I kept my eyes down as I entered. Couldn't bear to look up, couldn't bear to see his expression when he realized what a disappointment I was. Elena, my father said, and I heard the edge of disapproval in his tone, the subtle tightening that meant I'd failed him again. May I present? We've met. The voice stopped me cold, deep and quiet, with something in it I couldn't name. Something that made my pulse hammer against my ribs. I looked up, and found the Alpha King staring directly at me, those dark eyes holding mine with an intensity that made the rest of the room fade away. He wasn't smiling exactly, but there was something in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition, or something more complicated that I didn't dare interpret. We have? My father's voice came from very far away. The Alpha King didn't break eye contact with me. 3 years ago, he said. At the territorial summit, you were in the crowd. He remembered me? I couldn't speak, could barely breathe. My mind was racing, trying to understand how this was happening, how he could possibly remember one face among hundreds, one girl who'd been nobody special, nothing important. Your Majesty, my father said, and I heard the confusion in his voice, the recalculation. I wasn't aware you'd had the opportunity to meet my daughter. We didn't speak, the Alpha King said, finally breaking eye contact to glance at my father. But I remember thinking she was the only one in that crowd who actually listened to what I was saying, instead of just waiting for me to finish. The room tilted slightly. He'd noticed me. 3 years ago, in a crowd of hundreds, he'd somehow picked me out and remembered. I see, my father said, though it was clear he didn't see it all. Well, Shall we sit? The Alpha King moved to pull out a chair, but not at his own place. He crossed to where I stood frozen and drew out the seat to his right, waiting, an invitation. An honor I didn't deserve and certainly hadn't expected. I looked at my father, saw the tight line of his mouth, the warning in his eyes. Don't embarrass me. Then I looked back at the Alpha King, at this man I dreamed about in secret, and made myself move forward. Made myself sit in that chair he held, feeling the whisper of his presence behind me before he pushed it gently forward. Thank you, I whispered, hating how small my voice sounded. He returned to his own seat, and I became acutely aware of how close we were. Close enough to catch his scent, something like pine and smoke and winter air. Close enough to feel the heat of him, the sheer presence that seemed to take up more space than his body actually occupied. My father sat at the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral. I hope the accommodations have been suitable, Your Majesty. Very suitable, thank you. The Alpha King's voice was courteous, but distant, the tone of someone performing social niceties out of necessity rather than interest. Catherine appeared with the first course, her eyes widening slightly when she saw where I was seated. I could imagine what she was thinking. Why had he chosen to sit next to me, of all people? What was I doing there in that horrible dress, looking like I'd just rolled out of bed? The soup was some kind of butternut squash, rich and creamy. I picked up my spoon with trembling fingers, hyper-aware of every movement, terrified of doing something wrong. Elena is an unusual name, the Alpha King said quietly, and I nearly dropped the spoon entirely. He was talking to me, directly to me. It means light. I swallowed hard. My mother chose it. The words came out barely above a whisper. She died when I was young. I'm sorry. There was genuine sympathy in his voice, not the empty condolence most people offered. I risked a glance at him, and found him watching me with those impossibly dark eyes, something thoughtful in his expression. Beta Thomas, he said, shifting his attention to my father, tells me Elena has been instrumental in organizing the pack's historical records. My father's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. She assists with various administrative tasks, yes. I'd like to hear about that work, the Alpha King said, turning back to me. History is important. The patterns we forget are the ones we're doomed to repeat. He was quoting something, I realized. Something I'd read once in one of those dusty record books, and he wanted to hear me talk about it? My father cleared his throat. Perhaps after dinner, Your Majesty. We might discuss the trade agreements. After dinner, the Alpha King agreed, but his eyes never left mine. Right now, I'm interested in the records. It was a command dressed as conversation, and somehow, impossibly, he was giving me permission to speak. I drew a shaky breath. The records go back 7 generations, I said, my voice growing slightly steadier as I fell into familiar territory. They document everything from territorial disputes to bloodline tracking to major historical events. Many of them were damaged in the fire 20 years ago, so I've been working to restore and cross-reference what remains. And what have you learned? No one had ever asked me that. Not once in all the years I'd spent buried in those records had anyone expressed the slightest interest in what I might have discovered. That we're not as different as we think we are, I said slowly. The packs, I mean. We fight over boundaries and hierarchies. But the records show we've always been stronger when we work together. Every major threat we've faced, disease, human hunters, territorial invasions, we only survived because we unified. The Alpha King set down his spoon, giving me his full attention. Go on. It's just... I hesitated, aware of my father's disapproving stare. The current system encourages competition. Packs hoarding resources, refusing to share information. But historically, that's when we were most vulnerable. When we forgot we were all part of the same whole. Silence fell across the table. I'd said too much, revealed too much of what I actually thought. My father's jaw was tight with displeasure, but the Alpha King was smiling. Actually smiling. Something genuine and warm that transformed his entire face. That, he said quietly, is exactly why I'm here. And just like that, the evening shifted into something I couldn't have predicted. something that made my carefully constructed invisibility feel suddenly, dangerously fragile. Because the Alpha King wasn't looking at me like I was nobody. He was looking at me like I was exactly who he'd been searching for. Dinner continued in a haze of unreality. The main course arrived, venison with roasted root vegetables, the meat so tender it fell apart under my fork. I ate mechanically, barely tasting anything, too aware of the man beside me to focus on something as mundane as food. The Alpha King engaged my father in conversation about territorial matters, trade routes, the politics of the northern packs, but every so often his attention would shift back to me, a question in his eyes that I didn't know how to answer. My father dominated most of the discussion, as he always did, his voice carrying that particular blend of deference and barely concealed ambition. He wanted something from this meeting. I could see it in the way he leaned forward, in the careful modulation of his tone. Permission for something, access to something. My father never did anything without calculating the benefit first. The records Elena mentioned, the Alpha King said during a lull, cutting through my father's monologue about grain production. I'd like to see them. Tonight, if possible. My father's fork clattered against his plate. Tonight, Your Majesty. Surely you must be tired from your journey. I'm not tired. Those dark eyes fixed on me again, and I felt pinned in place, a butterfly under glass. Unless Elena needs rest? No, I heard myself say, my voice barely audible. I'm not tired either. It was a lie. I was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with sleep, worn down by years of being invisible, of making myself smaller and quieter until I almost disappeared entirely. But the thought of showing him the records, of sharing that space with him, sent something like electricity through my veins. My father's smile was strained. Of course, Elena would be honored to show you the archive room. The rest of dinner passed in a blur. Dessert came and went, something with berries and cream that I pushed around my plate. Coffee was served, dark and bitter. My father attempted several more times to steer the conversation toward whatever agenda he'd planned for this evening, but the Alpha King deflected each attempt with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime navigating political maneuvering. Finally, mercifully, the meal ended. Elena, the Alpha King said, rising from his seat. Shall we? I stood on unsteady legs, smoothing down the wrinkled fabric of my terrible dress. My father's expression was a storm of confusion and displeasure, but he couldn't very well refuse a direct request from the Alpha King. The archive is in the East Wing, I said quietly, leading the way out of the dining room. The house felt different at night, all shadows and golden lamplight. Our footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors, his confident and measured, mine hesitant and uncertain. I was acutely conscious of how I must look from behind, this shapeless brown dress hanging on my too thin frame, my hastily pinned hair already coming loose. Your father seems protective, the Alpha King said as we walked, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry. I almost laughed. Protective isn't the word I'd use. What word would you use? I hesitated, weighing honesty against self-preservation. But something about the quiet between us, the strange intimacy of walking these empty hallways together, loosened my tongue. Disappointed, I said finally. He's disappointed in me, has been since the trials. The trials, he repeated. And there was something in his tone, understanding, perhaps, or sympathy. You were 16? You know about that? I stopped walking, turning to face him in the dim hallway. Up close, he was overwhelming, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that would have been beautiful if it weren't so severe. But his eyes, those impossibly dark eyes, held something gentle. I know about a lot of things, he said quietly, including what happened during your first shift. Shame burned through me, hot and familiar. Then you know I'm defective. No. The word was sharp, cutting through the shadows between us. That's not what I know at all. Before I could respond, before I could process what he meant, he gestured down the hallway. The archives. I turned away, grateful for the darkness that hid the heat in my cheeks, and continued walking. The East Wing was older than the rest of the house, the air cooler and tinged with the scent of old paper and dust. I led him to a heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor and produced a key from my pocket. One of the few responsibilities my father still trusted me with. The archive room was exactly as I'd left it that morning. Shelves lined every wall, stuffed with leather-bound volumes and loose papers tied with string. A large oak table dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with the documents I'd been working to restore. Candles sat in holders on the shelves. We kept them instead of electric lights to preserve the delicate pages, and I moved through the room automatically, lighting them one by one until the space glowed with warm, flickering light. "This is incredible," the Alpha King said, his voice filled with something like reverence. He moved to the nearest shelf, fingers trailing over the spines of the books. "How far back do they go?" 7 generations on most bloodlines, I said, falling into the familiar rhythm of explaining my work. Some families have better records than others. The fire destroyed about 30% of our historical documents, but I've been cross-referencing with other packs' records when possible. He pulled a volume from the shelf, handling it with the careful respect it deserved. "You do this alone?" "Yes." I moved to the table, straightening papers that didn't need straightening, needing something to do with my hands. No one else is really interested in old documents. Then they're fools. The certainty in his voice made me look up. He was watching me again with that intense focus, the book forgotten in his hands. "History isn't just about the past," he continued, moving closer to the table. "It's about understanding patterns, about learning from mistakes. The fact that you can see that you've dedicated yourself to this work without recognition or reward, that takes a kind of strength most people never develop." I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. No one had ever spoken to me like this, had ever suggested that what I did mattered, that I mattered. "I'm not strong," I whispered. I couldn't even shift properly. He set the book down on the table, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Can I tell you what I know about your shift, Elena?" The use of my name sent a shiver through me. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I know that you have a rare wolf," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "Not a weak one, not a defective one. A wolf that exists at a frequency most pack members can't even perceive. I know that when you tried to shift at 16, you succeeded. But your wolf was so different from what everyone expected that they couldn't recognize it for what it was." The room spun slightly. "How do you—" "Because I've been searching for someone like you for 3 years, he said quietly. "Ever since that summit, when I saw you in the crowd and felt something I'd never felt before. A resonance. A connection to something I couldn't explain. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs." "I don't understand." He reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of touching mine, asking permission without words. I stared at that outstretched hand, at the implicit question in the gesture, and felt the weight of a choice I didn't fully comprehend, but I'd been invisible for so long. So tired of being nothing, of meaning nothing. I placed my hand in his. The connection was immediate and overwhelming. Heat rushed up my arm, through my chest, settling somewhere deep in my core. His fingers closed around mine, gentle but firm, and I felt something inside me respond. My wolf. That quiet, strange presence I'd learned to keep locked away, suddenly surging forward with a recognition that made my breath catch. "You feel that," he said, and it wasn't a question. "What is it?" "What we are to each other." His thumb traced a slow circle on the back of my hand, the touch both soothing and incendiary. "What we've been searching for." Before I could ask what he meant, before I could process any of it, a sound echoed from somewhere in the house. Raised voices. Something urgent. The Alpha King's expression shifted immediately. That gentle openness replaced by something harder, more alert. "Stay here," he said, releasing my hand and moving toward the door. But I'd spent too many years being told to stay, to hide, to make myself small. Something in me rebelled against the instinct to obey. I followed him. The voices were coming from the main entrance, growing louder as we approached. I recognized my father's tone, angry and defensive, and another voice, younger, with a sharp edge of panic. "Can't just barge in here demanding." "I have every right to be here," the other voice cut in. "Where is he? Where's the Alpha King?" We rounded the corner to find the entrance hall in chaos. My father stood at the bottom of the main staircase, his face flushed with anger, blocking the path of a young man I recognized. Silas, one of the Alpha King's guards. Behind Silas, the front door stood open, letting in the cold night air and the scent of something wrong, something that made my wolf stir with unease. Silas's eyes locked onto the Alpha King immediately. "Your Majesty, there's been an attack on the northern border. 3 packs ambushed by rogues. Heavy casualties." The Alpha King's entire demeanor changed, power coiling through him like a living thing. "How many?" "At least 40 confirmed. More missing. They're asking for you. Get the car ready." The Alpha King's voice was pure command now. No trace of the gentle man who'd held my hand in the archive room. "We leave in 5 minutes. Your Majesty," my father interjected, his politician's smile sliding back into place despite the circumstances. "Surely you should wait until morning." "Send representatives. You can't be expected to—" "Those are my people," the Alpha King said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "I will not send representatives." He turned to look at me then, and for a moment I saw something in his expression. Regret, perhaps, or frustration at the interruption. But duty was already pulling him away, responsibility overriding whatever had been beginning to grow between us in that quiet archive room. "Elena," he said, my name soft in his mouth despite the urgency of the moment. "Thank you for showing me the records." It was a dismissal. A kind one, but a dismissal nonetheless. The spell was breaking, reality rushing back in to remind me of what I was, a broken wolf in a terrible dress, completely unsuited for the world of Alpha Kings and pack politics and life-or-death emergencies. "Of course," I managed, hating how small my voice sounded again. I hope everyone will be all right." He held my gaze for one more heartbeat, and I saw something flicker in those dark eyes. A promise, perhaps, or a question left unasked. Then he was moving, following Silas toward the door, his guards materializing from wherever they'd been stationed around the house. My father watched them go with barely concealed frustration, then turned that frustration on me. "What did you say to him? In the archive room?" "Nothing," I said, which was both true and devastatingly false. "We just talked about the records. He spent the entire dinner focused on you." My father's voice was sharp with accusation. "Of all nights, Elena, you choose to wear that—" He gestured at my dress with disgust, and somehow still managed to capture his attention. I had important matters to discuss with him, trade agreements that could secure our pack's future, and instead he wanted to hear about dusty old books and your ridiculous theories about unity. Each word landed like a blow, but I was so used to them by now that they barely registered. I just stood there, watching through the open doorway as the Alpha King's car pulled away into the night, taillights disappearing into darkness. "Go to bed," my father said dismissively, "and tomorrow we're going to have a serious discussion about your behavior and your wardrobe and your complete inability to understand appropriate social conduct." He stalked away, leaving me alone in the entrance hall with the cold wind still blowing through the open door. I should have felt devastated, should have felt the familiar weight of shame and inadequacy settling over me like a familiar coat. But instead, I felt my hand, the one he'd held, the one that still tingled with the memory of his touch, and remembered the way he'd looked at me. Not with disappointment, not with pity, with recognition, with want. I closed the door against the night and made my way back upstairs, my mind racing. The Alpha King had called my wolf rare, not broken. He'd searched for me for 3 years. He'd felt that connection, that resonance that even now made my chest feel too tight, too full of something I didn't dare name. And he'd said we were something to each other, something important. In my room, I finally removed the terrible brown dress, letting it fall to the floor in a heap. But I didn't feel victorious about my small rebellion anymore. I just felt confused, overwhelmed, and desperately, dangerously hopeful. I lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every look, every touch. And when I finally slept, I dreamed of dark eyes and gentle hands and a voice saying my name like it meant something, like I meant something. 3 days passed with no word from the Alpha King. I told myself it was unreasonable to expect anything. He was dealing with a crisis, 40 casualties, probably more by now. an entire region in chaos. Whatever had happened between us that night, whatever connection I'd felt, it paled in comparison to the responsibility of ruling, of protecting his people. But knowing something logically and feeling it emotionally were two entirely different things. I threw myself into the records with renewed intensity, working until my eyes burned and my hand cramped from writing. The archive room became my refuge, the only place where the silence felt comfortable instead of condemning. Catherine brought me meals that I barely touched, her concerned glances growing more frequent as the days wore on. My father avoided me entirely, which was almost a relief. The morning after the Alpha King's departure, he'd summoned me to his study and delivered a lecture about propriety and expectations and my continued failure to be the daughter he needed. I'd stood there and absorbed it, as I always did, waiting for him to run out of steam so I could escape back to my books, but something had shifted inside me. The words still hurt. They probably always would, but they didn't define me the way they once had. Because someone else had looked at me and seen something different, something valuable. On the fourth day, Catherine knocked on the archive room door just after noon. "Miss Elena, there's someone here to see you." My heart leapt traitorously, but when I emerged into the hallway, it wasn't the Alpha King waiting. It was Silas, his young face grave and tired, dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Miss Elena," he said, inclining his head respectfully. "His Majesty sends his regards and asked me to deliver this." He held out a sealed envelope, thick cream-colored paper with the royal seal pressed into dark wax. My hands trembled as I took it. "How is he?" I asked before I could stop myself. "The situation in the north?" Silas's expression flickered with something, surprise perhaps, that I would ask. "Contained for now. The casualties were significant. His Majesty has barely slept since we arrived. He's been coordinating rescue efforts, negotiating with the neighboring packs, tracking the rogues responsible." Guilt twisted through me. Here I'd been, mooning over a hand touch and kind words, while people had been suffering, while he'd been trying to save lives. "Thank you for bringing this," I said quietly. Silas nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "He spoke about you, you know, during one of the long nights when we were waiting for news from the search parties. He said he'd met someone who understood that strength wasn't about dominance, that unity wasn't weakness." He glanced back at me, his young face earnest. "I thought you should know that even in the middle of everything, he was thinking about what you said." My throat closed up. I could only nod, clutching the envelope to my chest. After Silas left, I retreated to the archive room and stared at the envelope for a long time before finding the courage to open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting bold and precise. "Elena, I apologize for leaving so abruptly. The attack required immediate attention, and I've been unable to return sooner. The situation here has been challenging. We've lost good people and the survivors need support and reassurance. But I wanted you to know that I haven't forgotten our conversation. In fact, it's been sustaining me through these difficult days. You spoke about unity, about how we're stronger together than apart. I'm seeing the truth of that here, watching different packs come together to help the survivors, to hunt the rogues, to rebuild what was destroyed. Your insights in the archive room that night gave me a framework for understanding what needs to happen next. We can't continue operating as isolated territories, vulnerable to attacks like this. We need something more structured, more permanent. I'm proposing a summit, a gathering of all the major packs to discuss creating a unified council. And I want you there, Elena, not as your father's daughter, but as the historian who understands our patterns, our mistakes, our potential. I'll return in 1 week. We have much to discuss. D." I read it 3 times, my heart pounding harder with each pass. He wanted me at a summit. He valued my insights. He was thinking about me even while dealing with a crisis, and he'd signed it with just an initial. D, like we were friends, like there was an intimacy between us that didn't require formal titles. "Elena?" I looked up to find Catherine in the doorway, her kind face creased with concern. "Are you all right? You've been in here for hours. I paused, trying to find words for the tangle of emotions in my chest. I think I might be better than all right." She smiled, moving into the room to light fresh candles. As the afternoon light began to fade, the Alpha King's messenger, he seemed quite taken with you, kept saying how His Majesty spoke so highly of your work. "Catherine," I said slowly, an idea beginning to form. "Do you think, would it be possible to get some different clothes?" Her eyebrows rose. "Different how?" "Less—" I gestured at my current outfit, another shapeless dress in a dingy gray. "Less invisible. I have a summit to attend in a week, apparently, and I can't show up looking like I've given up on existing." Catherine's smile widened into something bright and conspiratorial. "Oh, Miss Elena, I thought you'd never ask." The next 3 days were a whirlwind of activity that felt completely foreign to my normal, quiet existence. Catherine, it turned out, had a sister who worked as a seamstress in the main Pack township, and between the two of them they seemed determined to transform me from ghost to person. "You're not trying to be anyone else," Catherine insisted as she pinned fabric around me for the third fitting. "You're just letting people actually see who you already are." The dresses they created were simple but elegant. Clean lines in deep blues and soft grays that somehow made my pale coloring look luminous instead of washed out. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that would draw unwanted attention, but clothes that actually fit, that moved with me instead of hanging like shrouds. "Your hair," Catherine's sister Margaret said thoughtfully on the 5th day. "It's beautiful, but you hide it." "May I?" I let her work, feeling strange and vulnerable as she trimmed away the damaged ends and shaped it into something deliberate. When she finally held up the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My blonde hair fell in soft waves to my shoulders, catching the light like water. Without the weight of the extra length, it had a natural wave I'd never noticed before. "Now you look like yourself," Margaret said with satisfaction. But looking like myself felt dangerous. Felt like hoping for something I had no right to hope for. My father noticed the change at dinner that evening. His fork paused halfway to his mouth, his expression cycling through surprise, suspicion, and finally calculation. "You look different," he said carefully. "Yes." I kept my voice neutral, refusing to apologize for taking up space. "This is about the Alpha King." It wasn't a question. About whatever happened in the archive room that night. "This is about me," I corrected quietly. "About deciding I'm tired of disappearing." His jaw tightened. "Elena, I don't know what he said to you, but you need to understand something. Men like that don't choose girls like you." He was being polite, nothing more, and if you've built some fantasy in your head based on one dinner conversation. "He's invited me to the summit." I pulled the letter from my pocket and placed it on the table between us. As a historian, to provide perspective on Pack unity and cooperation. My father snatched up the letter, his eyes scanning the page rapidly. I watched his expression shift, surprise giving way to calculation, giving way to something that looked almost like respect, though it curdled quickly into resentment. "He wants you there for your expertise," he said finally, setting the letter down. "That's all this is, professional courtesy. Maybe." I met his eyes steadily. "But even if that's all it is, it's more than I've had before. Someone values what I know, what I can contribute. And what exactly do you think you can contribute?" The old condescension crept back into his tone. "You're not a politician, Elena. You're not trained in negotiation or diplomacy. You spend your days with dusty books while the rest of us deal with real-world problems. Those dusty books contain 7 generations of real-world problems." I shot back, surprising myself with the sharpness in my voice. "Every mistake we're making now, we've made before. Every territorial dispute, every failed alliance, every misunderstanding that led to conflict, it's all documented. And if no one bothers to learn from it, we're just going to keep repeating the same patterns until we destroy ourselves." Silence fell across the table. My father stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time, and I realized with a jolt that I'd just said more to him in 2 minutes than I'd said in years of quiet acquiescence. "Well?" he said eventually, something unreadable in his expression. "Perhaps the Alpha King sees something I've missed." It wasn't an apology, wasn't even really an acknowledgement. But coming from my father, it was as close to approval as I'd ever received. The next 2 days crawled by with agonizing slowness. I continued working in the archives, but my mind kept drifting to the letter. to that single initial, to the memory of dark eyes and gentle hands. Catherine caught me staring into space more than once, a knowing smile on her face. "He'll be here soon enough," she said gently. "And when he arrives, he's going to see a young woman who's decided to stop hiding. What if that's a mistake?" The fear rose up suddenly, choking. What if my father's right, and I've built this all up into something it's not? What if he was just being kind, and I've misread everything? Catherine set down the book she was shelving and turned to face me fully. "Miss Elena, I've worked in this house for 15 years. I've seen your father entertain hundreds of important guests, and never, not once, have I seen anyone look at someone the way the Alpha King looked at you that night. How did he look at me? Like you were water and he'd been walking through a desert." She smiled softly, like he'd found something he didn't even know he'd been searching for. On the 7th day, I woke to commotion in the courtyard below my window. Cars pulling up, voices calling out instructions, the organized chaos of an important arrival. My heart started hammering before my mind fully caught up. He was here. I dressed carefully in one of the new dresses, a deep blue that Catherine insisted brought out my eyes, and took extra time with my hair, then felt ridiculous for caring so much. But I didn't change. Didn't retreat back into shapeless brown fabric and deliberate invisibility. The knock came an hour later. Catherine, slightly breathless, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "He's asking for you, Miss Elena. In the south parlor." "My father?" "Is in a meeting with the other visiting alphas." Catherine's smile turned mischievous. "The Alpha King specifically requested a private audience with you first." My hands were shaking as I made my way downstairs. The south parlor was one of the smaller, more intimate rooms, barely used, with large windows overlooking the garden. When I pushed open the door, he was standing with his back to me, staring out at the autumn landscape. He turned at the sound of the door, and I watched his expression transform. Surprise flickered across his features, followed by something deeper, something that made my breath catch. "Elena," he said, "my name a quiet benediction. You look—" He trailed off, crossing the room in 3 long strides until he stood directly in front of me. This close, I could see the exhaustion in his face, the new lines of stress around his eyes, the weight he'd been carrying. But underneath it all, that same intensity, that same focus that made me feel like the only person in the world. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," I whispered. "I promised I would." His hand lifted, hesitating near my face, asking permission. When I didn't pull away, his fingers brushed my cheek, gentle as breath. A week felt like a year. "How is the North? The survivors?" His expression sobered. "Healing. Slowly. We lost 37 in the end. Found most of the missing, though not all of them." He trailed off, pain flickering in his eyes. "The rogues responsible are being hunted. But Elena, this attack, it's exactly what you warned about. Isolated packs, vulnerable and unprepared because we refuse to share information or coordinate defenses. I'm sorry," I said softly. "For all of it. Don't be sorry. Be ready to help me fix it." His hand fell away from my face, but the warmth of his touch lingered. "The summit starts tomorrow. There will be 20 Alpha leaders present, all of them suspicious, territorial, convinced that cooperation means weakness. I need you to show them otherwise." "Me?" Panic fluttered in my chest. "I'm just a—" "You're the person who sees the patterns," he interrupted firmly. "Who understands that our history is a map, if we're willing to read it. You're exactly who I need, Elena." The way he said my name made something in my chest crack open, spilling out hope and terror in equal measure. "Okay," I breathed. "I'll help however I can." He smiled then, real and warm, and I felt the world shift underneath me. Felt something fundamental change in the space between us. "Good," he said quietly, "because I have a feeling that what we're building here, it's going to change everything." The summit convened the next morning in the Grand Hall, a space I'd only ever seen used for major pack celebrations, now transformed into something that felt more like a battlefield disguised as diplomacy. 20 Alpha leaders sat around an enormous circular table, each flanked by their advisors and guards. The air was thick with tension and barely concealed hostility, different pack scents mingling into something overwhelming. I stood near the back of the room with the other support staff, clutching a leather portfolio containing copies of the most relevant historical documents, trying to make myself invisible through sheer force of habit. But the Alpha King had seen me enter. His eyes found mine across the crowded room, and something passed between us. Reassurance, maybe, or recognition. He was dressed formally today, all authority and contained power, looking every inch the ruler he was born to be. Yet when he looked at me, I could still feel the ghost of his fingertips against my cheek. "Let's begin," he said, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation with effortless command. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. The attack on the Northern Territories has made one thing abundantly clear. We can no longer afford to operate as isolated factions." "With respect, Your Majesty," one of the older Alphas said, his voice gravelly with age and skepticism. "We've managed our territories independently for generations. This attack was tragic, but it doesn't necessitate a complete restructuring of pack governance. Doesn't it?" The Alpha King's tone remained level, but I could sense the steel underneath. 43 casualties, Alpha Raymond. 43 lives lost because the Northern packs had no warning system, no coordinated defense, no way to call for backup quickly enough to matter. The rogues who attacked knew exactly how to exploit our isolation. "Rogues attack," another Alpha interjected, a woman with sharp features and calculating eyes. "It's the nature of lawless wolves. You can't prevent every incident." "No," the Alpha King agreed. "But we can stop making it easy for them." The arguments began in earnest then, voices rising and overlapping, each Alpha convinced their way was right, their territory too unique to conform to any collective structure. I watched my father across the room, saw him nod along with the resistance, his expression carefully neutral but his loyalties clear. He didn't want change any more than the rest of them did. After an hour of circular arguments, the Alpha King stood, and the room fell silent. "I'd like to invite someone to speak," he said, his eyes finding mine again. "Elena, daughter of Beta Thomas, has spent years studying our historical records. She has perspective that I believe is relevant to this discussion." Every head in the room turned toward me. The weight of their attention was crushing. 20 of the most powerful wolves in the kingdom, all staring at the defective girl in the blue dress. I saw skepticism in their faces, dismissal, confusion about why their time was being wasted. My father's expression was a storm of barely contained anger. I was embarrassing him. Again. But the Alpha King was still watching me, and in his eyes I saw something different. Trust, expectation, belief. I forced myself to move forward, my legs unsteady, clutching the portfolio like a lifeline. The walk to the front of the room felt endless, every step echoing in the sudden silence. When I reached the table, I set down the portfolio with trembling hands. "I'm not a politician," I said, my voice coming out quieter than I'd intended. I cleared my throat, tried again. "I'm not trained in pack governance or territorial management, but I've spent the last 6 years working with records that span 7 generations of our history, and I've noticed some patterns." I pulled out the first document, a map I'd painstakingly recreated from multiple damaged sources. "This shows pack territories 150 years ago. Notice how much smaller they were, how much more interconnected. There were twice as many packs then, but they operated more like neighborhoods in a city than isolated kingdoms." Several Alphas leaned forward to look, their interest cautiously piqued. "Around this time, we faced a plague, a disease that affected only wolves, spread rapidly through pack populations. The mortality rate was catastrophic." I laid out another document, a death toll record that made several of the Alphas wince. But the packs that survived were the ones who immediately shared information about symptoms, treatment methods, isolation protocols. The ones who hoarded knowledge and tried to handle it alone, those bloodlines no longer exist. The room was quiet now, all attention focused on the documents I was spreading across the table. 50 years later, human hunters organized a coordinated campaign against wolf populations. Again, the packs that survived were the ones who worked together, shared intelligence about hunter movements, created safe passage routes, coordinated defense strategies. I met the Alpha King's eyes briefly, drawing strength from his steady gaze. The ones who insisted on handling threats independently, most of them were wiped out. "You're cherry-picking examples," Alpha Raymond said, but his tone was less dismissive now. "What about the territorial wars? The conflicts over resources?" "You're right," I acknowledged. "There have been numerous conflicts between packs throughout history, and every single one weakened us overall, made us vulnerable to external threats." I pulled out another document, this one a timeline. "Notice the pattern? Whenever we fight amongst ourselves, that's when we face attacks from rogues, from humans, from outside forces who recognize our division as opportunity." "So you're suggesting we just ignore our differences?" The sharp-featured female alpha crossed her arms. "Pretend territorial boundaries don't matter?" "No," I said firmly. "I'm suggesting we recognize that territorial boundaries are artificial constructs we created, and they can be restructured to serve us better instead of making us vulnerable. We don't have to choose between autonomy and cooperation. We just need a framework that allows for both." "And what framework would that be?" someone asked. I looked at the Alpha King. This was his vision to articulate, not mine. He stood, moving to stand beside me at the table, and I felt the warmth of his presence, the way the room's energy shifted with his movement. "A council system," he said. "Each pack maintains its autonomy over internal affairs, but we create a unified body to handle shared concerns, defense coordination, information sharing, resource allocation during crises. Decisions that affect multiple territories would require council approval, preventing any single pack from acting in ways that endanger others. And who leads this council?" Alpha Raymond's tone was sharp with suspicion. "You?" "A rotating leadership," the Alpha King responded calmly. "No single alpha holds permanent power. We serve terms, we hold each other accountable, we make decisions collectively." The arguments resumed, but they were different now. More substantive, less reflexively resistant. I stepped back, letting the alpha leaders debate the specifics, feeling strangely drained and exhilarated at once. The Alpha King caught my eye and mouthed a silent "thank you" before turning back to field questions. I retreated to the back of the room, my heart still racing, barely believing I'd just spoken in front of 20 alpha leaders without collapsing. Catherine appeared at my elbow with a glass of water, her face beaming with pride. "That was incredible," she whispered. "Did you see their faces? They were actually listening, but not everyone had been impressed." My father appeared beside me, his expression thunderous, his voice low and venomous. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" "Helping," I said quietly. "Like he asked me to. You made me look like a fool," he hissed. "Presenting theories to alpha leaders like you have any authority to speak on pack matters. Do you have any idea how many of them came to me after? Asking why my daughter is advising the Alpha King instead of finding a proper mate and settling down like she should?" The old shame tried to surface, but I pushed it down. "I'm sorry if I embarrassed you. That wasn't my intention. Your intentions don't matter, your actions do." His hand closed around my arm, tight enough to hurt. "Tomorrow you'll apologize to the council for overstepping. You'll explain that you were merely sharing historical curiosities, not presuming to advise on policy. And then you'll—" "Is there a problem here?" The Alpha King's voice cut through my father's tirade like a blade. He'd crossed the room without me noticing, and now stood close enough that my father had no choice but to release my arm and step back. "Your Majesty," my father said, his politician's smile snapping into place. "I was just discussing Elena's presentation with her. Her excellent presentation," the Alpha King corrected, his tone pleasant, but his eyes hard, which swayed at least half the holdouts toward supporting the council proposal. "She did exactly what I asked her to do." My father's jaw tightened. "Of course. I was merely concerned that she might have overextended herself. She's not accustomed to such attention." "Then perhaps it's time she became accustomed to it." The Alpha King's hand settled on the small of my back, a possessive gesture that sent electricity up my spine and made my father's eyes widen with shock. "Elena, would you join me for a walk? I'd like to discuss tomorrow's session." It wasn't really a question, though he phrased it like one, and I wasn't about to refuse. "Of course, Your Majesty," I managed, my voice steadier than my legs felt. He guided me out of the grand hall, his hand never leaving my back, leaving my father staring after us with an expression caught somewhere between fury and calculation. The moment we were in the hallway, away from prying eyes, I felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have interfered with your father. But the way he was gripping your arm, you saw that? I see everything that concerns you." He stopped walking, turning to face me in the empty corridor. "Are you all right?" The question, the genuine concern in his voice, threatened to undo me. "I'm fine. He's always like that. Disappointed in me. Then he's a fool." The Alpha King's hand lifted to my face again, that same gentle touch that made my breath catch. "What you did in there took courage. Real courage, not the kind that comes from physical dominance or political power. The kind that comes from standing up and speaking truth even when you're terrified." "I was terrified," I admitted. "Still am, a little." "Good. Fear means you understand the stakes." His thumb traced my cheekbone, a touch so tender it made my chest ache. "Elena, I need to tell you something. About why I've been searching for you." My heart stuttered. "Searching for me? Since that summit 3 years ago." He took a breath, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes. "I felt something when I saw you in that crowd. A pull, a recognition. I thought I was imagining it, that it was just attraction or curiosity. But then I couldn't stop thinking about you. Couldn't get your face out of my mind. I don't understand," I whispered. "Our wolves recognized each other," he said softly, "even though you couldn't fully shift. Even though your wolf is different from anything most people have encountered." She called to mine, and mine answered. The implications of what he was saying crashed over me like a wave. "That's not possible. I'm broken, defective." "No." His other hand came up to frame my face, holding me gently but firmly. "You're rare. Special. Your wolf exists at a frequency that most can't perceive, but I can feel her, Elena. I've felt her since the moment we met. And she's perfect." Tears burned behind my eyes. "You can't mean that. I mean every word." He leaned forward, his forehead resting against mine, and I felt the full weight of his presence, his power, his absolute certainty. "I've been searching for you for 3 years. And now that I've found you, now that I know you see the world the way I do, that you understand what needs to change. Elena, I don't want to let you go. I'm nobody," I breathed. "The daughter of a beta, and barely that. I can't even shift properly. What could I possibly offer someone like you?" "Everything," he said simply. "Perspective, wisdom, compassion, courage, the ability to see patterns and solutions that no one else can see. And that connection." His hand moved to rest over my heart, and I felt my pulse jump under his palm. That resonance between our wolves. That's not something that can be manufactured or forced. It's rare. Precious. "What are you saying?" His eyes held mine, dark and infinite and full of promise. "I'm saying that when this summit is over, when the council is established and the immediate crisis is managed, I want you to come with me, to the capital. I want you at my side, Elena, as my advisor, as my partner, as my—" A door slammed somewhere down the corridor, voices approaching. He pulled back reluctantly, his hands falling away from my face, leaving me cold and aching with the loss of his touch. "We should get back," he said quietly. "But think about what I've said, please." I nodded, not trusting my voice, my mind spinning with the enormity of what he'd just offered, what he'd just implied. We returned to the grand hall separately, maintaining appropriate distance, but I could feel his awareness of me like a physical thing, and when the afternoon session began and the debates resumed, every time our eyes met across the room, I felt that same pull, that same recognition, that same impossible, terrifying, wonderful possibility. By evening, the council proposal had gained enough support to move forward. Not unanimous, several alphas remained skeptical, but enough to begin drafting actual governance structures. The Alpha King declared the day's session concluded, and the various leaders dispersed to their accommodations, still arguing amongst themselves. I was gathering my documents when my father appeared again, his expression unreadable. "Elena," he said quietly, "we need to talk." "I'm tired," I said, not looking at him. "Can it wait until morning?" "No." His hand on my shoulder was gentler this time, almost hesitant. "I owe you an apology." That made me look up. In all my years, I'd never heard those words from him. "What you did today," he continued, his voice rough. "It was impressive. I didn't think you had it in you, and the way the Alpha King spoke about you, looked at you." He paused, something complicated passing over his face. "I've been so focused on what you couldn't do that I never noticed what you could." It wasn't much. Wasn't even really an acknowledgement of all the years of dismissal and disappointment. But coming from my father, it felt like a seismic shift. "Thank you," I said quietly. He nodded once, awkward and uncertain, then left without another word. I stood alone in the emptying grand hall, holding my portfolio of historical documents, feeling like the ground beneath my feet had fundamentally changed. The Alpha King found me there an hour later, after everyone else had gone. "Elena," he said softly, "have you thought about what I asked?" I turned to face him, this powerful man who somehow saw value in broken things, who felt a connection to my strange, inadequate wolf, who wanted me at his side. "Yes," I whispered, "and my answer is yes." His smile was like sunrise breaking over mountains, transformative and full of promise. "Then we should discuss the details," he said, moving closer. "Because what I'm proposing isn't simple. Being at the Capitol, working with the council, facing the politics and the scrutiny, it won't be easy." "Nothing about my life has been easy," I said. "At least this way, it'll matter." He reached for my hand, threading his fingers through mine, and I felt that now familiar surge of heat and recognition. "You've always mattered, Elena. You just needed someone to see it." "You saw it," I said softly, "even in that terrible brown dress." He laughed, the sound warm and genuine, "Especially in that terrible brown dress, because it told me you were brave enough to refuse to perform for others, to be exactly who you were, even when it would have been easier to pretend." "I was trying to hide," I admitted. "I know. But you can't hide light, Elena. It finds a way through." And standing there in the empty grand hall, his hand warm in mine, I finally began to believe that maybe my mother had chosen my name for a reason after all. The Capitol was nothing like I'd imagined. I'd spent my entire life in my father's house, surrounded by familiar forests and the quiet rhythm of pack life. The city that sprawled before me now was overwhelming. Buildings that stretched toward the sky, streets filled with wolves from dozens of different packs. The constant hum of activity that never seemed to stop. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The Alpha King, Dominic, as he'd finally asked me to call him when we were alone, had given me a suite of rooms in the eastern wing of the royal residence. They were beautiful, far too grand for someone like me, with tall windows that overlooked gardens I still hadn't found the courage to explore. But what mattered most was the library he'd shown me on my second day. 3 floors of books and documents, historical records from every major pack in the kingdom. "I thought you might feel at home here," he'd said, watching my face as I'd walked between the shelves in wonder. Home. The word had felt foreign on my tongue for so long, but standing in that library, I'd finally understood what it meant. 3 weeks passed in a blur of council meetings and late-night strategy sessions. The governance structure was taking shape slowly, with endless debates about jurisdiction and authority. I sat in on most of the meetings, no longer relegated to the back of the room, but at the table itself, providing historical context when disputes arose. Some of the alphas still looked at me with skepticism, but others had begun asking for my input directly. My father had returned home after the summit, his goodbye awkward and stilted. "You're doing well," he'd said, the words clearly difficult for him. Better than I expected. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd ever hoped for. Dominic found me in the library one evening, buried under a stack of territorial maps from the last century. He'd been in meetings all day with the northern packs, coordinating reconstruction efforts, and exhaustion lined his face. But when he saw me, Something in his expression softened. "Still working?" he asked, settling into the chair beside mine, trying to find precedent for the resource-sharing protocols Alpha Raymond keeps objecting to. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the strain of too many hours reading by candlelight. There has to be something in the records that addresses this. "Elena." His hand covered mine, stilling my frantic page-turning. "It's nearly midnight. The protocols can wait until morning, but the council meeting will happen whether you sleep or not." His thumb traced circles on the back of my hand, that simple touch sending warmth through my entire body. "You've been driving yourself into the ground for weeks. When was the last time you took a break?" I couldn't remember. The work had consumed me, partly because it mattered, partly because staying busy meant I didn't have to think too hard about what was happening between us. The touches that lingered longer than necessary, the way his eyes found mine across crowded rooms, the pull between us that grew stronger every day. "Come with me," he said, standing and offering his hand. "There's something I want to show you." I let him lead me through the quiet corridors, past sleeping guards and darkened rooms, until we reached a door I'd never noticed before. He produced a key, and suddenly we were climbing a narrow spiral staircase, up and up until my legs burned and my breath came short. We emerged onto the roof, the city spread below us in a carpet of lights, thousands of windows glowing like stars. But above us, the actual stars blazed even brighter, undimmed by the activity below. The autumn air was cold and sharp, and I shivered despite myself. Dominic's jacket settled around my shoulders before I could protest, carrying his scent, pine and smoke, and something uniquely him. He stood beside me at the edge, our shoulders almost touching, both of us staring up at the vast sky. "I used to come up here when I first became king," he said quietly, "when the responsibility felt crushing, and I didn't know if I was strong enough to carry it. My father died suddenly, heart attack, no warning, and I was 23 years old trying to hold together a kingdom that wanted to tear itself apart. I'd never heard him talk about his past, about the weight he carried. That must have been terrifying. It was. Still is sometimes." He turned to look at me, and in the starlight his face was both shadowed and illuminated. "But then I stood in front of a crowd 3 years ago and felt something I'd never felt before. A connection. A sense that somewhere out there was someone who might understand, who might see the world the way I did." My heart was hammering. "Dominic." "I know I should go slowly," he interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. "Give you time to adjust to life here, to being part of the council work. But Elena, I've waited 3 years, and every day with you here, every conversation, every moment, it just confirms what I felt that first time, what my wolf recognized before my mind could catch up." He took my hands in his, and I felt that familiar surge of recognition, of rightness. "You're my mate," he said simply. "I've known it since that summit, since I saw you in the crowd and felt like I could finally breathe properly. And I hope, you feel it too." Tears burned behind my eyes. "I'm broken," I whispered. "My wolf is incomplete. I can't give you what a proper mate should—" "Stop." His hands came up to frame my face, gentle but insistent. "Your wolf isn't incomplete. She's just different, rare, and she calls to mine in ways I can't even explain. Elena, I don't want a proper mate. I want you, exactly as you are. But what if I can't? What if I fail you? You won't." His certainty was absolute. "Do you know what I see when I look at you? I see someone who spent years being told she was worthless and still chose compassion, who was pushed into invisibility and used that space to learn, to grow, to understand things no one else bothered to see. I see strength, Elena, real strength, not the performative kind that comes from dominance." "I'm scared," I admitted, the words breaking free. "I'm scared of wanting this too much, of believing in it and then losing it." "I'm scared too," he said softly. "Scared of doing this wrong, of being what you need, while also being what the kingdom needs. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." He leaned forward, his forehead resting against mine, and I felt the full force of our connection, that resonance between wolves, between souls, that had been building since the moment we met. "Say yes," he whispered. "Be my mate, my partner, my queen. Queen." The word should have terrified me, should have sent me running back to the safety of invisibility. But standing there on that roof under the stars, wrapped in his jacket and his certainty, I felt something shift inside me. My wolf, that quiet presence I'd kept locked away for so long, surged forward with a recognition that made my breath catch. She wanted this. Wanted him. Had been calling to him all along. "Yes," I breathed. "Yes." His kiss was gentle and fierce at once, tasting of promise and relief, and something that felt like coming home. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pressing closer, letting myself feel wanted for the first time in my life. His hands slid into my hair, cradling my head, deepening the kiss until I was dizzy with it. When we finally pulled apart, both breathless, he was smiling, really smiling. Something bright and young that made him look less like a king and more like the man underneath. "We'll have to make a formal announcement," he said, already sounding more practical even as his arms stayed around me. "The council will have opinions. Some will object to you not being from a powerful bloodline. Let them object," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I've spent my whole life trying to be acceptable to people who were determined to find me lacking. I'm done with that. His smile widened. "There's my queen." The formal announcement came 2 days later, and the reaction was exactly as complicated as Dominic had predicted. Some of the council members were supportive. Alpha Raymond, surprisingly, was one of the first to offer congratulations. Others were openly skeptical, questioning whether a wolf who couldn't properly shift was suitable to be queen. But Dominic stood firm, his hand in mine as we faced the council together. "Elena has proven her value to this kingdom in the week she's been here. Her insights have shaped the very structure we're building. And more than that, she's my choice. My mate. That's not subject to council approval." The debates continued for days, but gradually the opposition quieted. And when the formal mating ceremony was held a month later, even the skeptics had to acknowledge that something had shifted in the kingdom. The council structure was working. Packs were beginning to cooperate in ways they never had before. And at the center of it all was a king who'd found his match in the most unlikely place. The ceremony itself was beautiful and overwhelming. I wore a dress the color of moonlight, my blonde hair woven with silver threads. Catherine had traveled from my father's house to help me prepare, tears in her eyes as she'd hugged me. "I always knew you were special," she'd whispered. "I'm so glad you finally see it too." My father attended, standing stiffly among the other pack leaders, his expression unreadable. But when the ceremony concluded and Dominic kissed me in front of the entire assembly, I saw my father nod, just once, a tiny gesture of acceptance that meant more than any words could have. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of adjustment. Being queen meant responsibilities I'd never imagined, public appearances, diplomatic meetings, decisions that affected thousands of lives. But it also meant having a voice that people actually listened to. When I suggested creating an archive system to share historical documents between packs, the council approved it unanimously. When I proposed education programs to teach young wolves about cooperation instead of just competition, Dominic made it a priority initiative. I was making a difference, actually changing things for the better. But the best moments were still the quiet ones. Late nights in the library with Dominic, working side by side. Early mornings on the roof, watching the city wake up, the gentle touches and stolen kisses that reminded me this was real, that I was chosen, that I mattered. 6 months after becoming queen, I stood in front of a mirror in our private chambers, barely recognizing the woman looking back. She had confidence in her eyes, strength in her shoulders. Her blonde hair caught the light like it always had, but now it seemed to shine instead of just reflect. She wore a simple blue dress, still my preferred style, nothing ostentatious, but she wore it like someone who belonged. Dominic appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the day's council session. "Ready?" "Almost." I turned from the mirror to face him. I was just thinking about that first night, when I wore that terrible brown dress to dinner. He crossed the room, pulling me close. I loved that dress, Liar. I loved what it represented, he corrected, smiling. You, refusing to perform. Being exactly who you were, even when it would have been easier to pretend. That's when I knew for certain. Knew what? That you were brave enough to be queen. His hand settled over my heart, where my wolf hummed with contentment. That you were everything I'd been searching for. I leaned into him, breathing in his familiar scent, feeling the rightness of this life we were building together. I'm still scared sometimes, I admitted. Still feel like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not. You're not pretending anything, he said firmly. You're just finally letting people see who you've always been. Elena, light in the darkness. My queen. My mate. My perfect match. Not perfect, I corrected, but I was smiling. Perfect for me. We descended to the council chamber together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever challenges the day would bring. The various alphas were already gathering, and I caught sight of familiar faces, Alpha Raymond nodding in greeting, the sharp-featured female alpha whose name I'd learned was Victoria offering a small smile. My father was there too, having traveled to the capital for this particular session. He caught my eye across the room and did something I'd never seen before. He smiled at me, really smiled, with something that looked almost like pride. I smiled back, feeling a weight I'd carried for years finally lift. The session began, discussions about territory disputes and resource allocation, the endless work of governing, but I no longer sat silently in the back. I offered suggestions, provided historical context, challenged assumptions when necessary, and when the meeting concluded hours later, Dominic squeezed my hand under the table. Well done, Your Majesty, he murmured. Your Majesty. The title still felt strange, but I was growing into it. Growing into this role, this life, this version of myself that I'd never imagined possible. That evening, Dominic and I walked through the gardens I'd once been too afraid to explore. Autumn was deepening into winter, the air sharp with the promise of snow, but wrapped in his arms, I felt only warmth. I have something for you, he said, producing a small box from his pocket. Inside was a silver pendant, simple and elegant, engraved with 2 wolves intertwined, one dark and one light. Our wolves, he explained, fastening it around my neck. Together. I touched the pendant, feeling its weight settle against my chest, not a symbol of what I'd lost or failed to become, but of what I'd found, what we'd built together. Thank you, I whispered. Thank you, he countered, for saying yes, for being brave enough to step into this life. For showing me that strength comes in forms I'd never considered. We stood there as darkness fell. 2 wolves who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built something beautiful from broken pieces. And when I looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the deepening sky, I finally understood what my mother had seen when she'd named me, Light. Not because I burned brightly for everyone to see, but because I'd learned to shine even in the darkest places, because I'd refused to let others define my worth. Because I'd chosen courage over comfort, hope over resignation, because I'd worn my worst dress to dinner and somehow found my way home. Months turned into years, and the kingdom transformed. The council system flourished, packs cooperating in ways that would have seemed impossible before. The archive system I'd proposed became a model for preserving and sharing knowledge. Young wolves learned that their value came not from dominance, but from contribution, from understanding, from compassion. And at the center of it all, Dominic and I built a partnership that was equal parts love and respect, passion and purpose. We faced challenges. There were always challenges, but we faced them together, 2 wolves whose connection had changed everything. My father eventually retired from his position as beta, and in one of our last conversations before he moved to a quieter territory, he said something I'd never expected to hear. I was wrong about you, Elena. I spent so long focused on what you couldn't do that I never saw what you could. You've become something I never imagined, something better than I deserved. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was acknowledgement, acceptance. And that was enough. Catherine visited often, always bringing news from home, always smiling at the life I'd built. I told you, she'd say every time. I told you that you were special, and standing in my library, surrounded by the history of our people and the future we were building, wearing simple dresses that finally felt like mine, I believed her. I'd spent so many years being invisible, trying to disappear, convinced I had nothing to offer. But I'd learned something crucial in my journey from that terrible brown dress to this crown I now wore. True strength wasn't about being the loudest or the most dominant. It was about having the courage to be exactly who you were, even when the world told you that wasn't enough. It was about choosing compassion over cruelty, understanding over judgment, hope over despair. It was about being light, even when surrounded by darkness. And as I looked at Dominic across the room, caught his smile, felt our wolves singing in harmony, I knew I'd finally found where I belonged. Not despite my differences, but because of them. Not as someone else's disappointment, but as exactly who I was always meant to be. Queen, mate, partner, light, Elena,